Yeah, so we've broken free from chapter 12 after a long time, and we're into chapter 13. And John, I'm starting to get a bit more familiar and aware of what John is doing with his little commentaries in different sections.
Yeah.
And so at the start of this chapter 13 is another one of his sort of, I guess it's like it's an interpretation of who he sees Jesus is and what he sees Jesus doing. So he says, it was before the Passover festival. Assuming this is the Thursday night. Is this the night of his betrayal?
Yes.
Yeah. So they celebrate the Galilean Passover.
Exactly.
Yeah, which happened on a Thursday night. You would only celebrate the Passover on the Friday night if you're in Jerusalem.
And remember this, though, Thursday night is the start of Friday.
Okay, right.
In the Jewish calendar. So it is the day of Pentecost, but it starts.
Passover, you mean?
Oh, sorry. The day of Passover.
Yep, okay.
But it starts for us on the night before.
So Jesus knew that his hour had come and he must leave this world and go to the Father. He had always loved his own who were in the world, and now he was to show the full extent of his love. Now, I'm wondering, because we're about to go into this section where he washes the disciples' feet. But I'm assuming that this little introduction here, that idea that he's now going to show the full extent of his love, is both an introduction to the washing of the disciples' feet, but also an introduction to the whole of the discourses he's about to say. But then really it's an introduction to his death.
Yeah, I think I came to that conclusion during the week too, Lucas. It just doesn't, like, it talks about him knowing that his hour had come and that he had to leave this world and go to the Father. And then it says that again in verse 3, which it seems to me means that verse 1 has to stand by itself, and then from verse 2 on, including verse 3, of course, there's another episode that John reflects on. But that, like you said, that verse 1 is an introduction to all that he's going to reveal to his disciples, right through to his prayer in chapter 17.
Yeah.
And from 18 through 19, 20 to his arrest and trial and crucifixion, and then his resurrection from the dead. So that the main event is still sort of looming ahead. And John is letting us know that, as an introduction to it, that Jesus knew exactly where he was in God's plan. He knew who he was, and he knew what he had to do, and he knew that the time was right then, that he'd come to the end of his ministry.
So he says that section there, just before we move on, that he'd always loved his own who were in the world, and now he was to show the full extent of his love. How do we interpret that? There's been some pretty clear passages in John 6 and other places where he makes it clear that there's other sheep that are not in this fold, and there's others outside, even what he's talking about with the Greeks in that last chapter. Obviously, there are those who he knows are going to respond to him. Are they his own? But he's also made it clear in, say, chapter 3 that his message is also a universal one, that he loves the whole world. But then here it's honing it in on that he loved his own who were in the world.
I think that's a great division. There are those who respond to the love of God and who are his own in that particular way. One of the passage in chapter 6, remember where Jesus said, all that the Father gives me will come to me.
Yeah.
Whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. So that his own, there's something going on in the world everywhere where the Father is trying to bring the world back onto line, the way that he had originally created it for. And mankind had this privileged place in God's plan for the future forever. And we'd rebelled, we'd gone away, the darkness had come, and God has been at work fulfilling his purposes. It was really essential that this sacrifice of the Son of God had to be made so that sin could be dealt with. And that's where Jesus is at right now, knowing that he had to continue with God's purposes in order to make this possible. But him dying on the cross was showing how much God loved the world, and he, with God, loving the world, was doing this for those who were going to be his own.
Yeah.
And I like in chapter 6, particularly in chapter, right in chapter 6, where, how can I bring it to mind? Jesus said something or other about, that's why, if I can find it, excuse me for not having it clear in my mind. I'm not good at picking things up out of my Bible because I've written all over it. And here it is. Here it is. He says, "I'm the bread which came down from heaven." And they said, "Surely this is Jesus, son of Joseph. We know his father and mother. How can he now say, 'I've come down from heaven'?" Jesus answered, "Stop murmuring among yourselves. No man can come to me unless he is drawn by the Father who sent me, and I will raise him up on the last day. It's written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who has listened to the Father and learned from him comes to me." I think that's the criteria. His own are those who have listened to the Father and learned from him. And as a result of that, deep in their hearts, they have made this approach to God and received the mercy that God wants to give to us, the fullness of his grace, and we become his own. And again, he'd always loved his own who were in the world, and now he was to show the full extent of his love. Doing what he did at the supper, washing their feet, that doesn't show that's not a good way of showing your love. Well, it's a good way, I suppose, but what he was talking about there had to be, I think, Jesus willingly allowing himself to be captured and condemned to death by the Sanhedrin and then put to death by the Romans. That's the full extent of his love, that he was prepared to go that far in making salvation possible for us.
And I suppose as well, that statement there is making in contrast to what he's just been talking about in the previous chapter. I mean, normally this would be read all in one go. And so you would have just heard about, again, the unbelief of the Jewish leaders who saw all the signs that Jesus was doing but refused to believe.
Yeah.
All right, so then you mentioned there in verse 2 that the devil had already put into the mind of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. So there...
There's a real tangle there, Lucas. I was reading it like the original in the Greek, trying to read it, I should say. And that story begins with during supper. And then there's this long bit about, well, not a long bit, but a sentence about Judas's betrayal. And it kind of puts that in, and then the bit about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, sort of all in one sentence. And
Yeah.
just
He's been preparing us for the Judas thing because, he mentioned earlier about how he'd been pilfering the money after Judas got upset about the way that Mary had poured the perfume on Jesus' feet and said that he'd been stealing from the purse. So we're kind of prepared for this part of the story.
yeah, it seems like John is carrying that storyline about Judas betraying Jesus right back from chapter 6, when they were talking together after he'd been rejected by most of his followers, all of his followers except the 12, it seems, who were offended at Jesus saying that he was the bread of life and that they had to, in some sense, eat him, eat his flesh and drink his blood. And there after that, and he was explaining to the disciples, look, after you see me going back to where I came from, then you'll understand why I've said what I've said. And he said, haven't I chosen you, meaning the 12, but one of you is a devil? And John points out there that he meant Judas Iscariot, who was going to betray him.
So way back there.
The storyline comes all the way through, and now he's kind of making it clearer and clearer where Judas is coming from.
So what do we make of this in the light of what we know of modern psychology and sort of the motivations and the drives that people have? Just John's interpretation is the devil had already put into the mind of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. What's the interaction there between the kind of the motivations of a human being and the action of the devil who's at work? I mean, in that last chapter, we've had that section about the hearts that are hardened and blinded, and that it's it's sort of that combination of people choosing, but also the way that God set things up a little bit. Yeah, how do we reconcile all that?
I don't know enough about psychology to connect the dots as far as what the psychologists understand are concerned, but I know in myself, and I suppose that's where psychology eventually comes from, our own knowledge of ourselves, our inner being. And I think I see so clearly that there is, the two work together, certainly with God, like I just tried to say, that those who hear his voice and learn from him, and I think that means the whole of our experience is created in the image of God, living in the creation of God. It's impossible for us not to know deep down in our own psyches that there is a God, that there is something there at the beginning of all things, and in which we live and move and have our being.
That's where you talk about that intuition.
Yeah, and that we do have to respond to that. But then I know from myself that I get all tangled up with other thoughts, other dreams, the desire to create a world for myself, where I'm the hero and I'm the god and I'm the winner in every way. And it's somehow to bring that into submission to this truth that has been revealed by God in nature around about us, and then particularly through the scriptures to the Jews, and then finally through Jesus and him being here present. It's and I think it's exactly the same, whether we're that choice that we make from ourselves, we either have to move in the direction of God or move in the direction of what is beyond our own rebellion, and that's Satan.
Yeah.
So that I don't think it's only Judas that gets caught up in Satan's plans. If you refuse to get caught up in God's plan, you'll eventually get caught up in Satan's plan, whether
Yeah.
you like it or not. You probably don't think you will, but you
Well,
will.
I mean, what you'll think is that you're just suiting your own needs and building your own world. But you don't realize that you're actually building Satan's world.
Yeah, which is a no world. There's
Yeah.
it's a nothingness.
Yeah. Because we can't exist, ultimately, we can't exist independently of God.
Exactly that.
All right, so then this is still John's commentary here in verse 3. During supper, Jesus, well aware that the Father had entrusted everything to him and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from the table, laid aside his garments, taking a towel, tied it around him. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel. Now, I find it extraordinary that John's interpretation or John's explanation of Jesus has come to this point where he knows exactly who he is. He's well aware the Father has entrusted everything to him. So I guess we're saying everything, the whole universe to him.
And God's plan. And God's plan.
And God's plan. Okay, yeah, God's plan would be the biggest sort of. So everything to him in his plan, and it's all there in Jesus' hands. And I suppose that the power of God in there, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. So he knows his identity and where he's going, and that Jesus chooses to express this reality of who he is in this amazing act of service to his disciples, that he takes off his outer garment. I imagine that must have been, he laid aside his garments and taking a towel, tied it around him. That was like a humbling thing in that culture,
Yeah.
that he would remove his outer garment and tie a towel around him and then wash their feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much there, Lucas. We really need, I think, to go back and read the Synoptics, because this is obviously that Last Supper when Jesus set that sacrament of breaking bread and drinking wine as a symbol of really committing yourself and accepting what Jesus had done by dying and rising again. That symbol was put here or established at that supper, but John doesn't say anything about it. He doesn't actually tell exactly how the bread and it doesn't mention the bread and the wine as a sacrament, whereas that's exactly what the synoptic writers do. They leave out this example that Jesus said of love by washing their feet.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
but they're very, very clear on the institution of this sacrament.
So do you think that that people reading this would have been fully aware of the fact that Jesus had the Lord's Supper in this context, because they were familiar with the synoptics and that the synoptics had come before John?
I don't know whether the synoptics came before John or not. I don't think anybody does, but oftentimes they say the synoptics were written first, and then old St. John knew all about them, and then he decided to write his gospel to fill in the gaps. I think that's nonsense, personally. It was an old record written by one of the church fathers. I've forgotten who and when, but around about 400, I think, or in the 400s. But anyway, here's an example where it's not the synoptics who leave the gaps, but it's John who leaves the gaps. And we have to go back to the Gospels to fill in the bits that John didn't think were the most important bits. Or maybe he thought it just didn't need to be. It was so well established. Or it could even be, and I've read this somewhere or other, that somebody suggested that that the Lord's Supper had become instituted that every Sunday that Christians from right in the first century began to meet on Sunday to break bread as a way of sort of showing their allegiance to Jesus and their commitment to accept his salvation in his way. That was like their common practice at their love feast. And then I think, well, the suggestion that I've read is that they became kind of, when you get familiar with something and it loses its power.
Yep.
And that maybe John wanted to focus on not what, like the external ceremony, but on the deeper real meaning and significance of what the Lord's Supper is all about. And that's why he, the book that you just read, like you said, verse 3 is John's comment that Jesus was well aware that the Father had entrusted everything to him and that he'd come from God and was going back to God. This is John kind of thinking. And then I haven't been able to get away from this passage all week, actually. And it's incredible just to think about it. But it seems to me like that John is in his mind's eye actually seeing what happened. He's so detailed, during supper, Jesus, knowing who he was, fully realizing his identity and his purpose, then he says that he rose from table, laid aside his garments, taking a towel, he wrapped it around him. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel. There's so much detail there. And I think the two things must have been together in John's mind. Jesus' identity and purpose, and then this amazing thing that he did in washing the disciples' feet. And that's the bit where I think the synoptics really are necessary for us to understand the full significance of it all, because in Mark's gospel, on their way to Jerusalem, even before they went to Jerusalem, John and James, the sons of Zebedee, had approached Jesus and said, "Lord, we want something." Although I think it's Matthew says it was their mother who actually approached Jesus and said, "Will you make my sons to sit on your right hand and on your left hand in the kingdom?" And so even though Jesus in Mark's gospel just previously had said they were on their way to Jerusalem, and Mark said his disciples were quite excited and filled with awe, and those who were following were scared stiff because they already knew that the warrant was out for Jesus' arrest, that he was walking into real trouble. And then Jesus called the disciples aside and told them that he was going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to be captured, they were going to torture him and spit on him, that he was going to be killed, crucified, and then he was going to rise from the dead. And straight after that, it talks about Matthew and James and
John.
James and John.
John. Yep.
Amazing. John. It would have been clear in John's mind that they had come wanting to have this privilege of sitting on his right and left. And it shows that they still had these grand ideas from their Israeli heritage that the Christ was going to be the ruler of everything, worldwide conqueror and the rest. And they wanted to be sure to be at the center of that action. And Jesus had told them in chapter 10 there, look, he asked them, "Are you able to drink the cup that I've got to drink and have the baptism that I'm going to have?" And they said, yes, we will. And Jesus said, well, you will, meaning that they would vicariously,
Yeah.
if he did it, that he would share it with them. And then he goes on and says, but for who will sit on my right and my left hand in the kingdom, that's not for me to say, but it's already been, somebody's already got the job. And that's when he said about in the kingdom of God, it's not like this world where the great ones lord it over their followers.
Yep.
But he said, that's not how it's going to be with you. And then he says, that's where he says,
the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Exactly. Yeah. And
so what Jesus, like this little story of washing the feet is part of Jesus transforming John's worldview.
Well, he's been trying very, very hard the whole 3 years he's been with them.
Yeah.
And it's pretty slow for a worldview to change.
Yeah.
And this was probably, well, John himself, as he thought about it, he says now he's going to show the full extent of his love. And so the message got on. But I had the picture of John watching Jesus. Of course, the other ones would be too. But watching Jesus, well, I didn't quite. Next time we should read the bit out of Luke chapter 22, where this whole thing about who was going to have precedence rose at that supper, right in the middle of Jesus thinking about his death, setting up this sacrament to remind his followers and to give them a way of sort of participating in his death. And here the disciples are squabbling still amongst themselves at the feast about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. They didn't give up, and they were probably feeling antagonistic towards each other and sulky and not in the right mood. Just sort of. It's nice to think that the disciples. I often sit in church feeling grumpy. And I think a lot of people do, just thinking of how, doggone, this
grumpy, jealousies.
Yeah.
Competitiveness. Yeah. It's all there.
That's how the disciples were. So Jesus, it must have captured everybody's attention. There they are squabbling amongst themselves about who's going to be the greatest. And then the Lord stands up, takes off his coat or whatever outside garments were, ties a towel around himself. And I can just imagine them all, can't you?
Yeah.
Watching him. I think they would have all stopped talking. They would have watched him get himself ready, put the towel around him. Then they would have watched him pour water into a basin. And then to watch him start washing their feet.
Yeah.
And
so do you think if you were doing a harmony of the Gospels, you would have that story about them squabbling happening fairly soon just before this Last Supper?
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. In Mark's Gospel, it's obvious that they were squabbling even on the way to Jerusalem.
Okay, so they've been squabbling for a while because they think it's all happening now.
And then in Mark and in Luke, it makes it clear that they are actually squabbling at the Lord's table.
Right.
Startling. And then when you see how John has, or how Jesus actually has responded and stopped the discussion altogether, and the fact that John and his brother James were the first ones to sort of make a move to try and be Jesus' lieutenant in the kingdom, lieutenant governor. John would have been particularly struck
Yeah.
by what Jesus did right there, standing up, undressing, putting the towel around him, getting the water in a basin to come and wash their feet. And I tried to work it out. How long does it take somebody to wash your feet?
Mm.
Uh, even like the way they washed, apparently, I looked that up, is that they had water in a basin, and then they would uh, use some kind of a dipper, I suppose, and pour water on each foot,
Mm.
and I suppose rubbed it, and then wiped it with the towel and put it down, lifted up the next foot,
Yeah.
poured water on, wiped it, dried it with the towel. I mean, there were 12 of them.
Yeah.
That's 24 feet.
Will they be all whispering amongst themselves?
That's what I'm wondering. Like, we know the next section that Peter says, "Hold up, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet."
Yeah.
So he spoke. I would imagine that the others would be thinking their own thoughts as well.
Yeah.
He thought as what was Judas thinking, you know? But
Oh, he must have been freaking out.
how long would it have taken, do you reckon? Would it be a minute on each person?
25 minutes, 2 minutes on each person.
2 12s, that's half an hour.
Okay. 15 minutes.
Between 15 minutes and half an hour, they were sitting there
Yeah.
watching Jesus wash their feet. Can
Yeah.
you imagine that? What
Yeah.
would you feel if you were sitting there?
Well, you'd feel embarrassed, I think.
Embarrassed, uh, not game to say what Peter said. Peter
Yeah.
had at least the courage to say what he thought, and what he felt. Oh, it's unbelievable. And
Because like they'd be embarrassed too because this is not the vision that they would have normally had of someone who is a great leader, who is the Messiah, someone who is about to potentially lead them to this amazing victory over the Romans or the enemies or whatever. Yeah. So it's a whole change in their perspective on what leadership looks like in the true sense.
exactly that. And I think of John, like while he was sitting there, he was maybe thinking those thoughts that you said, how that Jesus was really aware that the Father had entrusted everything to him, and
Yeah.
that he'd come from God and that he was going to God. John sort of grasping who Jesus is, his identity, and then feeling this one kneel at your feet and lift each foot and wash it and dry it. Wow.
And dirty feet as well,
Well, that comes out in the next section again.
or sandals, like
Yeah,
sandals and long walks along dusty roads.
I'm wondering whether they still had their sandals on or whether they all kicked them off at the door.
Oh, yeah.
But if they had them on, Jesus would have had to take their sandals off as well.
Yeah.
But I got caught up in prayer, thinking of John's being there and the others as well, and being forced for maybe half an hour, just after all their squabbling,
Yeah.
to come to watch what Jesus is doing, and all the thoughts that would go through your mind. And
Mm.
anyway, it happened to me as I was praying, and I just couldn't. It was just the kind of experience that you don't have words to explain it. It just is. But what it does is shows the extent of his love. You
Mm.
know, we haven't got to Calvary yet, but even here at this last supper with them, uh, to think of the Creator God who made the world, the Word who became flesh and dwelt amongst us, when John says, we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And he's showing his glory by washing my feet.
Yeah.
Personally.
And
Look,
that's what glory really is.
how can you get your head around that? That you're loved like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyway.
And that the character of God is actually incredible humility.
Yeah, exactly
That's
that.
part of God's glory, is humility, not just power and might or whatever, but a human being who would stoop down and wash the dirt off another human being's feet.
Yeah. And you talked about having a worldview change. That's enough to really jolt you into coming to grips with the reality
Yeah.
that our lives here ought not to be lived for ourselves,
Yeah.
but to be lived for Jesus Christ, who loved us and gave his life for us.
And let's face it, those disciples, they had an incredible amount of stuff to process. Like you think about, all their expectations coming into Jerusalem, all of the opposition, then here they are, they're having this experience where Jesus is sort of redefining what a real leader is and what real humility is. And then his death, and then the resurrection. You can, then 50 days to Pentecost and the Spirit comes. They've just got so much to work through, so much to grapple with, that it would have taken them a long time to process it all.
And I think too, Lucas, it's not just working through it, but letting it work out.
Yeah.
And that's what
Maybe. Yeah.
That's why they spent the rest of their lives doing what they did.
Yeah. And that's what happens to us as well. I guess we, different stages, you grapple with different parts of the story and you respond to it, you live it out, you act that out, and the reality of it takes a stronger hold in you as you learn to do that yourself. So you can interact with the story by listening to it, but then to actually do what the story is saying and see that story actually work in your own life.
Yep.
And work in the lives of others around you. That's where the power is.
I watched them playing cricket here. It was funny the other night. The cricketers, after they finished, found a baseball bat. And they had great fun playing baseball without like the bases or anything like that. It was hilarious, but because they were making so many mistakes, they're used to using a bat, but using a baseball bat as something like a cricket bat. But anyway, it's like that with love. You can learn about love and you know the rules and you see what it does, but you grow in love as you practice love. I think that's essential.
You also have to practice accepting it, receiving it.
That's what I grappled with. Like I was like Peter when I got that kind of felt like I was like Jesus was washing my feet. Who am I that you would wash my feet?
Yeah.
Shut up, Laurie. Just let me.
Yeah.
You won't know what I'm doing, but you might find out eventually if you think hard enough. But what it's showing is his personal love for each one of us.
Yep.
I missed your question now. But,
it doesn't matter. We'll come back to that that interaction with Peter next week.
Okay.
And start from there. I think that'd be good.
Excellent.
All right, thanks. That's good. Good thoughts to go away with.
See you later.
See you soon.